So, guys, I want to do another tough video and talk about Andre Kielbon, the man who almost drove me to suicide. One of the first people to ever do that, because I've had family members make me feel that way, and other people in my life make me feel that way. And what happened was that I used to work at a job called Conway when I first graduated college, and I dealt with workplace bullying, mental health discrimination, and PTSD because I was almost murdered by the police. And I just want to go over, I just want to talk about some themes about this. That I think one of the themes is mental health discrimination, which means that you look at somebody, you think that they're mentally ill, or you treat them like they're mentally ill, like, oh, well, I can call you whatever, name in the book, or I can treat you whatever type of way because you have a mental illness. The other thing that this is about is that also what extends into harassment, because a lot of times people don't realize that when you do workplace bullying or sexual harassment, it becomes a legal issue. And then the last thing that I'll say is ultimately teaching our children wrong, because what I was always taught when I graduated college was always think about the paycheck, work all the hours that you can, always say yes to a boss. When you're ever disrespected at work, you just call them a nincompoop and you move on to the next job. That it's career is more important than grudge. In life sometimes we have to pick and choose our battles, and that's very, very important. But if we always teach our children to walk away from every fight, to not create consequences when people hurt them, you're going to set your children up for failure, because most of them are going to be like, no, why should I do my best? Why should I put my best in the world? My role is to be everybody's bitch, to be an object, really. So this is why you watch videos like this, to learn that that's a very wrong old school way of teaching. So what happened was that when I first worked at Conway, this was August 2010, so I got the job because they were looking for an assistant manager, and I said that, I'm looking for a job, and, I got 2 degrees and I'm just doing really good. And I remember they were kind of a smart ass to me, when I got the job, really. It was a different manager, Abu was his name. And then he was kind of hey, what you do is you work from the bottom up, really. So, start as custodian, then you'll get a higher paying job. So, the first day that I worked there, there was a woman that stole 30, 40 broads. He ripped her purse in half. The next thing that happened was that he would get mad at me every 2 seconds, shaking his head, rolling his eyes, and also saying something like, you're not doing that good of a job, so I'm going to put you on workplace probation. And then 2 hours later, there's another employee saying, hey, why are you putting this guy on probation, really? He just started. And he was welcome to Conway, really. So, this was kind of and then also this was kind of one of the other issues that you always have to pay attention to when you first start a job, which is if the management is being disrespectful to you. If it is disrespectful, it's a sign of a red flag. If it is a thing where there's violent customers, or they have to do unprofessional things rip people's purses or whatever in half, really, so be it. That's not a professional job. The next thing that happened was that when I walked home from work, I was throwing up all over the street. And, I remember telling my dad about that. He was a little concerned, but, he wasn't too concerned. And really my father's mentality through this entire experience that I had was, it should be a motivation for you to get a better job, or don't go to the Department of Labor to talk about these things. Or the other thing too is you just got to grit your teeth and deal with it, which is a stupid ass philosophy. So a few months later, Andre Kielbon starts working there. He was out on an injury. He had a leg injury. And it was that thing too. I felt a little relieved because, he was really nice and really friendly, always shaking my hand every 2 seconds. But I remember the first day he showed up, he wanted me to get on my hands and knees and scrub the outside of the store. And, a bunch of customers were looking, a bunch of people were looking at me, a bunch of employees were looking, and they're kind of hey, that's just not, that's not right, really. But I remember being very insecure in myself. Also, my father was, I have feelings about my father. sometimes he was emotionally abusive. Sometimes he would put me down for having mental illness, or when I got in trouble, it always seemed to be about mental illness and other things like that. So, when I saw Andre, I looked at him as like a father almost, because, and also too, my dad was very condescending about me getting a better job. Or I remember, like, I think I tell people the story about what happened to me, that, my dad wanted me, one of my fathers wanted me to be a tutor. I saw a tutoring job. He helped me be a tutor. He got me all dressed. He got me all nice up. And then when I applied for the tutoring job, they said I was underqualified. Then my dad started shouting and yelling in my face about applying for a job that I wasn't qualified for. Like, what the fuck, really? You really just led me into something, and then you're contradicting yourself. And I remember my other father, kind of flipping out, really, because he expected me to get a better job. Like, their mentality was, oh, well, just a little yelling and a little screaming to a kid who's never been taught how to get a job, that's just the best way to do it. But, now with all three of my brothers, we all work for we all work for the state of Connecticut, really, because my dad has had to use his nepotism and connections, really. But at first, he kind of was like with me, just screaming and yelling and saying the word fuck a lot, because he just thought that the best motivation is fear, intimidation, bullying, condescending. Like, you better fear me if you when I come home, if you don't get $100,000 job and a salary. Or I remember sometimes when I had conversations on the phone with people when I was looking for a job before I moved out with my brother and worked at Conway, my dad would rip open the door and be like, get in my face and be like, like, when does it start? How much does it pay? The money, Byron, the money. So, sometimes this is also what happens too, and this is another talking point, is that when you're also have a child and you're always rude and bullying and condescending, or being like the job, the money, the paycheck is really important, then, sometimes when your kid gets bullied, it's also because they have low self-esteem, and because you're teaching them, you're the kid, and because you are the child and I'm the adult, I have every right to disrespect your ass, and that's never a good way to raise a kid. The next thing that I would say is that, because with Andre, when he was disrespectful to me many, many times, a lot of it was kind of very similar to how my father would raise me, like I remember like one time my father, Charles, said things like, hey, Byron is stupid, he can't learn. Or I remember, like, and I'll talk about another story, like one time we went for brunch. I didn't remember the names of like the people that were there, friends of the family. My dad was like, Byron, you're a fucking asshole. And, other things like that. And I also remember, another time, my dad wanted me and my brother to come up with food that we never had before, like try something different for dinner. So my brother couldn't come up with things. My dad threw him through a chair and it broke, really, thinking that he was being a smartass, So when you grow up with bullying, when you grow up with domestic violence, when you grow up with a philosophy that you're a child and parents can put hands on you, you're a child, you can be smacked, you're a child, parents can poke you and spank you, like pat you on the butt, like I've talked about in other videos, or you're taught that parents can talk to you whatever type of way, that then it all just manifest in sometimes people turning into adults that are either abusers or tolerate abuse, like I was doing. So with Andre, like a couple months passed by, like there was like a few weeks before Christmas. There were things just like, like he wanted me to stand on like 50-foot ladders and put up Christmas decorations. Like what happened was he wanted me to use like fish line and tie like a gift basket to a line of wire and hang it from the ceiling of a store. And it's like it's almost like, and you have to stand on the top of a ladder, really. So automatically this is an OSHA violation. Automatically you should get scaffolding, and automatically it's a really, really stupid idea. So I remember, like, always, like, I couldn't get to the top, really, because I was always, like, shaking. It was like my body would do that. And it's also, like, you were intimidated to do that. So I remember later that day, really, that he wanted me to put fixtures, like, hang fixtures that you used to hang, like, store items. I actually put it on the wrong desk. And he's like, God damn it, you stupid fucking son of a bitch. You can't, and he said, do you want to quit? Do you want to quit? And then he was like, no, you're not going to quit. And I also remember, like, a few times I've asked him if I could go on vacation, because my brother was going to take us to do a trip to Disney World. And I remember him glaring his eyeballs at me and saying, if you ever ask for a vacation, I will terminate you. you are not allowed to leave. I will tell you when you leave. And then also too with Andre, like he would always give me a lot of anxiety, really. And so when I have anxiety when I was younger, a lot of people thought that I was autistic because I would keep my eyes low because I was intimidated of people. The other thing about it is that like when he would use puns or play on words or hyperbole or other things like that, I would take it as literal just because I was kind of shot up with a lot of anxiety, really. So the store got robbed by its own security guards. I'll do another video about that. So what happened is Calvin Landy and I forgot her name, Maria or whatever, they robbed the store. I was almost murdered by the police. They were aiming guns at me. I thought it was suicide. I remember calling my father, saying, I tell him I love him, and I'm going to be dead, and thinking that was going to happen, really. And nothing happened. But the cops aimed guns at me. They were snickering. Handed into the police department. They were making racist comments. And I remember, Andre saying, the reason why I booked you to work in the morning, Byron, was that I thought something like this was going to happen. And I also would say other things too that again, after I talked to my father, he said, isn't this the reason you need a better job? You need to let it go, get a better job. And they're also forcing people to be like, okay, after the robbery, after almost like your PTSD or whatever you experienced, you have to work the rest of your shift or you are fired. And Calvin Landy and Marilyn, whoever robbed the store, what happened was that they robbed the store because there was workplace bullying and sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. So they robbed the store, because the rule was that if you were a man, you were expected to do all the overtime or stay extra. If you were a woman, if you were pretty, you got the holidays off. And also, if you were a woman, you were pretty, you got the jobs where you get bonuses. You get bonuses. Like if your section of the store, if the linen department or the shoe department or other departments, if they got a lot of sales, you get like $50, $100 bonus. Then also my grandmother died. Then 8 or 9 months later, my grandmother died. He changed my work schedule, so I would miss. What happened was that he didn't want me to go to her funeral. He wanted me to work. He said, I see my grandma more often than you, and he was flashing his teeth at me. And then the other thing about that is, and the other thing about that was that when I went to her funeral, he had to change my work schedules to be like, oh well, I'm going to suspend you because you. We're not here Friday to check your schedule to realize you should have been working the weekend. So not even a phone call, just some random weekend, I'll do that. And then also he would do a lot of sabotaging. So a lot of times when I would work hard, he would have women walk around the store, check my work, or he would do things like pull me away and make me do cashiering or other jobs. So it's almost like, my job was custodial, but the whole store looked filthy and dirty just because he would pull me away many times and he would be defensive and dismissive. And I remember a couple of times he would have me sit in a chair, he would yell and curse and scream in my face and threaten me. And people were always saying too, why don't you get up and punch him in the face, or why don't you do other things like that? And it was two things, because I was scared that I was going to kill this man. I was scared that I was going to beat him with a hammer. I think I might have said too that the last day of my job, I had to tear down scaffolding. That's what they called it. Pallets. Pallets are these wooden things you put items on. But I had a hammer, and I had a couple of other items, like a small sledgehammer and a couple of saws to tear that down, really. But like I said, I always tell the story that I was afraid every single time he yelled in my face at his office, because that's where I kind of kept the stuff, because I could have easily grabbed it and just bashed his brains out, just like they do in prison, really. And also too, if you go to prison and they hear my story, this is hypothetically, but if hypothetically I got mad enough to bash his skull in, or bash his kneecaps in, or bash him to death with a sledgehammer, or a hammer, or if I did that shit, really, you get a lot of respect in prison, and if people hear the story, because I know one thing you get respect for in prison is, if you go there for beating up a bully, or if you beat up a chomo or something like that. But but thankfully that didn't happen. And it was also one of those things that again, like I said, that it was, he tried to do it to other people, or sometimes there'll be people screaming in his office being like, hey, you're not gonna force me to sit down, you're not gonna stand above me and yell at me, and now I'm actually like close to 40 years old, so nobody's gonna pull that shit on me. But when I was younger, a lot of people did that because they thought that I was naive and special needs and other things like that. There are some other like really painful stories, but I also remember the last day that I worked at Conway. He would get on the announce table on the announcer's desk, and he would say things like, everybody's doing a first place, second place, third place job. Byron's doing 100 place. He was kind of like instigating me over and over. I remember walking out of the job, and then he accused me of shoplifting. So I emptied my pockets. He was grabbing my shoulder, grabbing my arm a bunch of times, really. But I remember I watched the movie Taxi Driver that day, and I was kind of like snickering, like, just like Robert De Niro's character, like almost like, I just liked how he's being a smart ass to his boss in the beginning of that film. If you remember, like, he was planning to be a cab driver, and he was saying anytime, anywhere, clean like my conscience. But it was kind of a thing where, it was like 2.5 years of this. And I remember, like, my father, Kevin, telling me, hey, you just let it go, or it's going to drive you crazy, or suggesting I take medication to let it go. And I also told him some things like, my boss would do things like, I remember one time I was stuttering over my words because I was intimidated by him. And Andre was like sipping his coffee and saying something like, I don't understand what you're saying out of your fucking mouth. All I hear is what, really? And my dad's like, he's the most despicable person I ever met. Then also when I told him about going to the Department of Labor to report these things, and I did had a conversation one time with the Department of Labor, my dad said, no, you are not doing that. You just let it go, and you focus on getting a better job. And ultimately, that's a failure on my father's part. And I don't care if he sees the video or not, really. But the point of it is that that's retarded, because what does that teach? That teaches you tolerate harassment, and you tolerate workplace bullying, and you let it go, and you don't create consequences for people. And the problem is that, it teaches this, that whenever Byron does bad things to people, it matters. When other people do bad things to Byron needs to suck it up and persevere. Like, as to quote the Joker, Byron has to be a good little boy that has to tolerate everything, not go werewolf and run wild. But the point of it is that, if I had a child and I chose to raise my child, I'd say, okay, we're going to get some payback. So the first thing that you do is you get a better job. The second thing that you do is you go on Google, you go on Yelp, you do all this stuff, and you just leave bad reviews. You be honest. You do YouTube videos and leave bad reviews and be honest as hell about what happened. And then next you call the corporate office. Next you link them to some of the videos, and you just keep doing a smear campaign. Take it to a certain level. Don't take to the level of harassment, but put it out there that this is what happened. Because if you do not do this, if you don't do it, if you don't fucking do it, you're saying that anybody can you in the face, and you just have to tolerate it and get a better job. And also this old school mentality of tolerating bullying, saying, okay, it's part of the job. Think of the paycheck, think of the budget, think of the money, think about, moving out of your brother's place. You're a loser for living with him. That shit's got to end, because we're going to set up our children for failure. We're going to teach them that everybody has the right to walk all over them. Why are there so many millennials nowadays who don't work? Who don't have that work ethic? What do you think there's a lot of millennials nowadays who are either doing a lot of online work, or they're doing remote work, or they're doing like around their schedule, or there's a lot of millennials who, like some people I know who marry into money, or there's some people who do OnlyFans, or there's some people who just do YouTube content. The reason why that happens is because it's been really reinforced for such a long time that if you do the 9 to 5, you tolerate a boss, you're tolerating, you're going to tolerate a lot of things. When you're younger, people know that you don't know a lot of the workplace rules, such as, workplace bullying, sexual harassment, being held over, double standards. And I also remember that at Conway, two things that happened, when Tanisha, she was almost murdered by the police. Really, she got like free therapy for 2 weeks. And I remember like one time they were like, saying stuff like, "Oh, don't talk to Byron about it. Keep it quiet from him." And I also remember too that they never gave me an employee handbook because they didn't want me to understand the rights that I have. Or I used to buy a lot of stuff at the store, and they were told not to tell me about employee discount because they wanted to take my money really. So it was a bad experience because, I think for a long time in my life, I had a lot of resentment and anger. And I remember like being bullied in the New Haven film community as well. People making comments about my skin color. And I remember like that in Conway inspired me to say, you know what, I want to be a sociopath for a couple of years. And then I just developed that mentality and I got out of it, but that destroyed my life as well, really. But I also remember like, when I started working at Southern, I put up a post saying something online about like how I call my older brother lazy because we both want the same afternoon shift job, but he didn't do it. And I remember like my father like saying, "Oh, you're lazy because you live with your brother. You're lazy for this thing, that thing." But his point was, don't speak badly about family online. I know that I'm doing that right now, really. But I remember telling myself, I did the 40-hour film project 15 times a year. I'm connecting. There's a lot of people who like my work. And also, too, when I've done the competition, I submitted to different continents and different countries. So ultimately, I've had a film of mine shown on every country except for South America and Antarctica. I mean, through the 48-hour film project. So, like, I know that that's not a big accomplishment at 38 years old, but when I was 27, 28, that was a huge accomplishment for me. So I stopped talking to my father because I was kind of like saying, you just preach horrible advice. Workplace bullying, your son almost being driven to suicide, your son having PTSD, all that doesn't matter. It's just about the paycheck, and it's all just about the paycheck, really. And it's all about, tolerating. And like I said, there's a reason why, I think there was a shooting in Connecticut, like at a Budweiser factory. There's a reason why people bring guns to work. There's a reason why and there's a story that there was an employee that was bullied by Andre as well, who committed suicide during the time that I was working at Southern, and he kind of acted, and when Andre heard about it, he was kind of acting like, wow, like this is something cool, really. I dripped someone to suicide. I love the power of driving people to suicide, really. There are people who are fucked up like that. And then also with Conway, it was a sociopathic workplace because it really taught that if you behave like a middle schooler, if you do bullying, you had unreasonable expectations, the upper management are doing that to the managers of the stores. So now it's an environment of sociopaths. It's an environment of sociopaths. And it gave me a lot of PTSD. And I told the story when I did the New Haven 48-hour film project. I brought up my story. It was treated with mockery, and people were looking at me like a special needs person sharing too much when I was trying to say, hey, this experience around my PTSD is why I do filmmaking, even though I lost control of my emotions and I did it in a very emotionally unintelligent way. But overall, I'm happy that I shared this because, I'm working at a job now where I've mentioned that they want me to do overrun. So if I work 12 hours, it can become 13 or 14 hours, no problem. But if I work a 16 hour, that can become like a 17 and a half or 18 hour. So, like I always tell people, never ever put your heart and soul in the workplace because you will get taken advantage of. The day you think a job cares about you, you're going to be disappointed. So always work hard on yourself. If you like your job, if you want to sell yourself to the company's door, no problem with it. But make sure it's a job that respects you. If it starts not respecting you, you have to make it a big deal and make some noise. But also the other thing too is that be careful of your goals and just be reasonable. And like I said, if you have a job and they're like, okay, well, I stay over like an extra half an hour or 90 minutes or whatever, but nobody else does. Then you have to point that out, really. So you have to fight fire with fire, and you also have to just learn from my story, which is two things: raise your children to not be bullies, raise your children to be like, okay, this is the workplace, this is how it goes in the workplace. Here's the things to watch out for. If you have any of these problems, you talk to me, and we'll deal with it together. And then there's other things too about as well, really, that be honest about your experiences. Do something about it. And if you have to bring it to HR, do it. If you have to bring it to Google or YouTube reviews, do it. If you have to do something store reviews or district manager or whatever, do it, because otherwise you're going to live in this world of people walking all over you, and we can't do that, because if you always walk away from a fight, you're just gonna grow up to be a big pussy, So you can't teach your kids that. Sometimes, if you do walk away and you let things go and you say, hey, you know what, bygones be bygones, if that's what you want to do, that's good. But if you have hurt, disturbance, and resentment and a lot of tough feelings, then it's something that you have to address.